The rain had been falling since early morning, turning the gray sky even darker. It felt as if the world itself was mourning Eleanor. The funeral had ended only an hour ago, yet the large house already felt empty and cold. I stood quietly near the living room window, staring at the wet garden Eleanor had loved so much. For 20 years, we had built a life together in this house. Every corner held memories, her laughter in the kitchen, the way she hummed softly while watering her roses, and the gentle smile she gave me every morning. But now, all that warmth was gone. Behind me, her 4 children sat around the dining table. Daniel, the oldest, looked impatient as he checked his watch. Claire sat beside him, whispering something to Marcus, who seemed more interested in his phone than the situation. Sophie, the youngest, tapped her fingers nervously on the table. I had raised them like my own. I paid their tuition, supported their dreams, and stood by them when life became difficult. Yet today, not one of them looked at me with kindness. The lawyer finally cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Thank you for coming," he said calmly. "Today we will discuss Mrs. Eleanor Hayes' estate." Daniel leaned forward immediately. "And the amount?" he asked. The lawyer opened a thick folder. "Mrs. Hayes' total estate is valued at approximately $18 million. Marcus let out a quiet whistle. Claire's eyes widened slightly. Daniel nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had expected all along. "And how is it divided?" he asked. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "According to the will, the financial estate will be divided equally between her 4 children." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Claire smiled. Marcus leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. Daniel simply nodded. "No one said a word to me." The lawyer turned another page. "However," he continued, "Mrs. Hayes also left a personal item to her husband, Mr. Thomas Hayes." 4 pairs of eyes turned toward me. "What item?" Sophie asked. The lawyer reached into the folder and placed a small envelope on the table. He slid it toward me. My hands felt strangely heavy as I opened it. Inside was a rusty key, attached to a small brass tag. Engraved on the tag were 2 simple words, Orcas Island. Marcus laughed first. "You've got to be kidding." Claire shook her head in disbelief. "That's it." Daniel smirked slightly. "Well, I guess Mom knew exactly what she was doing." Their laughter echoed in the room, sharp and uncomfortable. I didn't respond. I simply stared at the key resting in my palm. It was old, worn by time, and strangely heavy. The meeting ended quickly after that. Papers were signed, accounts were discussed, and plans were made for the millions they had just inherited. Not once did anyone ask me where I would go. As I stepped outside into the cold rain, I looked down at the small key again. Somehow, it didn't feel meaningless. In fact, it felt like Eleanor had left me a message, and deep down, I had the strange feeling that Orcas Island was only the beginning point. 2 days after the meeting with the lawyer, I found myself standing on the deck of a small ferry, heading toward Orcas Island. The cold wind from the ocean brushed against my face, and the gray water stretched endlessly around us. In my coat pocket, the rusty key felt heavier with every passing minute. I kept asking myself the same question: why would Eleanor leave me this? The ferry slowly approached the island harbor. Small wooden docks and quiet houses appeared along the shoreline, surrounded by tall pine trees and misty hills. The place felt peaceful, almost untouched by the rush of the outside world. Once I stepped onto the island, I pulled the brass tag from my pocket and looked at the address again. It simply read, Crescent Road. A small cafe near the harbor seemed like the best place to ask for directions. Inside, the smell of coffee and warm bread filled the air. An older woman stood behind the counter, wiping a mug. "Excuse me," I said politely, showing her the tag. "Do you know where Crescent Road is?" The woman glanced at the tag and then looked up at me with quiet curiosity. "Up the hill," she said slowly. "About 20 minutes from here." Then she added something strange: "There's only one house up there." That comment stayed in my mind as I walked along the narrow road surrounded by tall cedar trees. The farther I walked, the quieter the world became. No traffic. No voices. Just the sound of wind moving through the forest. Finally, at the end of the road, I saw an old wooden cabin stood alone on a small hill overlooking the ocean. Its paint was faded, and the porch looked worn from years of storms. For a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake. Why would Eleanor leave me something like this? I slowly climbed the wooden steps and stood in front of the door. My heart beat faster as I pulled the rusty key from my pocket. The key slid into the lock perfectly. With a quiet click, the door opened. Inside, dust floated in the sunlight coming through the windows. The cabin was simple, just a small living room, a fireplace, and a wooden table, but something immediately caught my eye. On the wall above the fireplace hung a framed photograph of Eleanor. She was smiling the same gentle smile I remembered so well. Below the frame sat a small envelope. My name was written on it in her handwriting. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a letter. Thomas, if you are reading this, it means my children received what they always wanted, money, but you deserve something far more important. My heart pounded as I continued reading. The real truth is hidden beneath the floorboards under the fireplace. I looked slowly toward the wooden floor near the fireplace. Suddenly, the rusty key in my pocket didn't feel like a cruel joke anymore. It felt like the beginning of something Eleanor had planned long before she was gone. My heart pounded as I stared at the wooden floor beneath the fireplace. Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. The real truth is hidden beneath the floorboards. For a moment, I simply stood there, unsure if I truly wanted to know what was hidden. My hands trembled slightly as I knelt down beside the fireplace. The wood was old, scratched by years of use. I pressed my fingers along the edges of the floorboards until I felt one that was slightly loose. Carefully, I lifted it. The board creaked as it moved, revealing a small hollow space beneath the floor. Inside that space sat a metal box, dark and slightly rusted from age. My breath caught in my throat. I slowly pulled the box out and placed it on the floor beside me. It was heavier than I expected. For a moment, I just stared at it, remembering Eleanor's calm smile and the quiet way she used to think about things before making decisions. Finally, I opened the lid. Inside were dozens of documents neatly stacked together. First, I didn't understand what I was looking at. There were papers with company names, investment records, and property documents. Some of them dated back more than 20 years. My eyes moved quickly across the pages: stock certificates, land ownership deeds, investment accounts. Each paper carried Eleanor's signature. My confusion slowly turned into shock. Eleanor had been building something, quietly, carefully, for decades. At the bottom of the box lay a sealed envelope along with a bank statement. I picked up the statement first. When I saw the number printed at the bottom of the page, my hands nearly dropped the paper. $92,000,000,090-$2 million. For a moment, the cabin felt like it was spinning around me. I had known Eleanor was careful with money, but this was something completely different. I quickly opened the envelope. Inside was another letter. Thomas, if you have reached this part, then you now understand why I gave the children the $18 million. That money was never meant to last. My chest tightened as I continued reading. Our children never learned the value of patience or responsibility. Giving them everything would only destroy them, but you were the one who stayed beside me when I had nothing. You were the one who believed in building something slowly. Tears blurred my vision. The final lines of the letter were written more carefully, as if she had taken extra time to think about them. The fortune in this box belongs to you, not as revenge, but as trust. I lowered the letter slowly and looked around the quiet cabin. Outside, the ocean waves rolled against the cliffs below the hill. The wind moved gently through the tall cedar trees surrounding the house. For the first time since Eleanor's death, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not sadness, but the quiet realization that Eleanor had left me something far greater than money. She had left me a second chance, and somewhere deep inside me, I knew that this story, our story, was far from over. Nearly a year passed after I discovered the truth hidden beneath the floorboards of the cabin. Life on Orcas Island was quiet and peaceful. The mornings were filled with the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs, and the evenings ended with golden sunsets over the water. For the first time in many months, my mind felt calm. Eleanor's letter remained on the wooden table beside the fireplace. I read it often, sometimes wondering how carefully she must have planned everything, but far away from the island, things were not going as smoothly for her children. Daniel's business, which he had once proudly called the future of technology, began collapsing under poor management and reckless spending. Marcus had invested most of his inheritance in risky ventures that failed one after another. Claire had purchased a massive luxury home that quickly became impossible to maintain. And Sophie's boutique store struggled to survive in a competitive market. The $18 million that once seemed endless began disappearing much faster than anyone expected. At first, none of them contacted me, but eventually, the phone calls began. Daniel called one evening, his voice no longer confident. Thomas, I was wondering if you might be able to help me out financially. I paused before answering. I'm afraid I don't have much to offer, I replied calmly. After that call, weeks passed in silence again. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A large black SUV drove slowly up the gravel road toward the cabin. I watched from the porch as all four of them stepped out of the vehicle. Daniel, Claire, Marcus, Sophie. Their faces were tense and angry. They walked quickly toward the cabin door. You lied to us, Marcus shouted the moment he entered. Claire held a stack of papers in her hand. We know about the hidden accounts, she said sharply. $92 million. Daniel stepped forward, his voice filled with frustration. That money belongs to our mother. It should belong to us. For a moment, the cabin was completely silent. I calmly reached for Eleanor's letter and placed it on the table. You should read this, I said quietly. Point one by one, they leaned closer and read the letter. The anger slowly faded from their faces as Eleanor's words filled the room. By the time Sophie finished reading the last line, tears rolled down her cheeks. Daniel looked at me differently now, less angry, more confused. You knew this the whole time, he said softly. I nodded, yes. Marcus shook his head. So you just let us fail? I looked toward the ocean through the window before answering. No, I said calmly, you chose your own path. The room fell quiet again. Outside, the wind moved through the tall cedar trees, and the waves continued their steady rhythm against the cliffs. Eleanor had been right all along. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money. Sometimes, it's the truth people must face about themselves.